It started with something small, not a major event, not a difficult conversation, nothing that would stand out if someone asked me to explain when things began to feel different. It was just a moment, the kind that usually disappears without leaving a trace. But for some reason, this one stayed. It happened on a Thursday evening. Work had ended the way it always does. People closing laptops, chairs rolling back from desks, someone mentioning traffic before heading toward the elevator. The office slowly emptied out, like air leaving a room. I stayed a little longer than most people. Not because I had extra work, just because leaving immediately sometimes feels like stepping into another routine too quickly. So I sat at my desk for a few minutes after everyone else had gone. The building gets strangely quiet when most of the employees leave. The sound of keyboards disappears, conversations fade, and all that's left is the soft hum of the lights and the distant echo of footsteps somewhere down the hallway. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the room. Rows of empty desks. Computer screens going dark one by one. A coffee cup someone forgot to take with them. For years, scenes like that never meant anything to me. They were just the normal ending to another ordinary workday. But that evening something felt slightly different. Not wrong, just distant. When I finally left the building, the sky outside had already turned that deep blue color that appears right before night fully settles in. The parking lot was half empty. Cold air moved across the pavement, carrying the faint smell of rain from somewhere far away. I got into my car and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. It's a habit I've developed over the years, those quiet pauses before driving home. A few minutes where nothing is expected from me. No emails, no conversations, just silence. Usually those moments pass without much thought. But that night something unusual happened. I looked up at the office building through the windshield, and for a second, the entire place felt unfamiliar. Not physically. Everything looked exactly the same. The same windows, the same gray walls, the same lights glowing on different floors. But something about my relationship to it had shifted. The building didn't feel like a place I belonged to. It felt like a place I visited every day. The thought surprised me. I had worked there for almost 8 years. Long enough to know the routine of the place without thinking. Long enough to walk through the hallways automatically. And yet sitting there in the parking lot, I had the strange feeling that I was slightly outside of it. Like someone observing a scene instead of participating in it. I drove home slowly that night. Traffic moved in long lines under the streetlights. Red brake lights stretching ahead in a quiet pattern that repeated at every intersection. While I waited at one of the lights, I noticed a man in the car next to me staring straight ahead. His expression looked calm but tired. Not exhausted, just the kind of tired that builds up quietly after many years of repeating the same schedule. For a moment, I wondered if he was thinking about something similar to what I was feeling, or if he was simply driving home like every other night without questioning anything. Most people probably do. Routine has a way of protecting us from certain thoughts. As long as the day keeps moving, there's rarely time to stop and look too closely at it. When I got home, the house was exactly as I'd left it in the morning. The small lamp near the couch, the jacket hanging over the back of a chair, the faint smell of coffee still lingering in the kitchen. For years, walking into that house at the end of the day had always felt comforting, predictable, stable. But that night, standing in the doorway, I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. The silence. Not the peaceful kind, the empty kind. The kind that exists when a place hasn't been filled with conversation or movement for a long time. I turned on the kitchen light and set my keys down on the counter. For a moment, I just stood there, listening. The refrigerator hummed softly. A car passed somewhere outside, and then the house returned to complete stillness. That strange feeling from the parking lot earlier in the evening returned again. The quiet sense that I was observing my own life from a slight distance. Not disconnected, just aware. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table. Normally by this point in the evening, I would turn on the television or scroll through my phone. Anything to fill the empty space between dinner and sleep. But that night I didn't reach for anything. I just sat there. The longer the silence stayed in the room, the more noticeable my thoughts became. At first they were normal. Things I needed to do tomorrow. Bills coming up next week. A reminder to pick up groceries. But underneath those practical thoughts was something else. Something quieter. A question that didn't fully form into words. Just a feeling that something about my life had slowly changed without me realizing it. For a long time, I tried to ignore that feeling. Not because it was painful, just because it was inconvenient. Life works best when you don't examine it too closely. You wake up, you go work, you come home. Days pass smoothly when you treat them like steps in a familiar routine. But that night, something inside me refused to return to autopilot. I thought about the last few years. Nothing dramatic had happened. No crisis. No major disappointment. In fact, by most reasonable standards, things had gone fairly well. Stable job, a quiet house, a life that made sense on paper. But sitting there in a quiet kitchen, I realized something uncomfortable. My life had slowly become something I maintained instead of something I actively lived. The realization didn't feel dramatic. It felt subtle, like noticing that a clock in a room has been ticking the entire time, but you only just heard it. And once you hear it, you can't unhear it. Later that night, I stepped outside for some air. The street was quiet. Most of the houses around me were dark. A faint wind moved through the trees, making the branches shift softly under the streetlights. I stood near the edge of the driveway and looked down the road. And suddenly the thought appeared. Not loudly, not emotionally, just clearly. For the first time in a long while, I felt like a visitor inside my own routine. Not trapped, not unhappy, just slightly outside it. Watching, observing, trying to understand how I got there. I stayed outside longer than I expected. The cold air helped slow my thoughts. And gradually, a strange curiosity replaced the quiet tension I had been feeling earlier. If I was beginning to see my life from the outside, what exactly was I looking at? That question stayed with me long after I went back inside. I turned off the lights and sat in the living room for a while before going to bed. The house was silent again, but the silence felt different now. Less empty, more like a space where something important had just started to move. And although I didn't know where that thought would lead yet, one thing felt certain. Once you begin noticing the distance between yourself and your own life, it becomes very difficult to stop looking. The next morning began exactly the way most mornings do. The alarm rang at the same time. The coffee tasted the same. The sunlight came through the same corner of the kitchen window, casting a pale rectangle across the table. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside my head, the thought from the night before was still there. Not loud, just present, like a quiet observation waiting patiently in the background. I felt like a visitor inside my own routine. The sentence repeated itself a few times while I drank my coffee. I tried to ignore it at first, but once a thought like that appears, it has a way of following you through the day. The drive to work felt familiar, but my attention was different. I noticed things I usually passed without thinking. A man jogging along the sidewalk. A delivery truck parked awkwardly near a corner store. A woman standing outside a cafe, staring at her phone like she was waiting for a message that hadn't arrived yet. Ordinary scenes. Things that happen every day in every city. But this morning they felt slightly more noticeable. As if something in my awareness had quietly turned up the brightness on the world. When I arrived at the office building, the parking lot was already filling with cars. People stepped out carrying bags, coffee cups, backpacks. Most of them walked quickly toward the entrance. The pace of the workday beginning. For years, I had been part of that movement without thinking. But that morning I stayed in the car for a moment longer. Watching. Again, that strange feeling returned. The one I noticed the night before. The sense that I was observing something I normally moved through automatically. Inside the building, the office looked exactly the same as always. The hum of computers starting up. Someone laughing at a joke near the printer. The faint smell of burnt coffee drifting from the break room. Routine in motion. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. Emails appeared. Calendar notifications. A reminder about a meeting later in the afternoon. Normal workday details. But as I started reading through the messages, I noticed something strange. I felt slightly detached from the urgency of it all. Not careless, just aware. Aware that the same cycle would repeat tomorrow, and the day after that, and probably next year. Around mid-morning, my coworker Daniel walked over to my desk. He leaned against the divider the way he always does. "You look like you're thinking about something serious again," he said. "Do I?" "Yeah, that quiet look you get." I smiled slightly. "Just didn't sleep great." "That's what everyone says when they're thinking about something else," he replied. He wasn't wrong. but explaining the thought in my head would have sounded strange. How do you tell someone you suddenly feel like an observer inside your own life? So instead, I asked him something simple. Do you ever feel like your days are repeating themselves a little too perfectly? He laughed. Every Monday. I mean, really repeating, I said. Like, exactly the same. He thought about it for a moment. Honestly, I try not to think about that too much. Then he shrugged. If things work, I don't question them. He tapped the edge of my desk once before walking away, and his answer stayed with me longer than I expected. If things work, I don't question them. That seemed to be the rule most people followed. Maybe it was a rule I had followed too. Until recently. The rest of the workday moved quickly. Meetings, phone calls, numbers on screens. But the thought from the night before kept returning. Not aggressively, just quietly asking the same question again and again. Why do I feel slightly outside my own routine? After work, instead of driving straight home, I took a different road. Not dramatically different. Just a small detour through an older part of the city. The kind of neighborhood where the buildings have been standing for decades. Small shops. A barber pole spinning slowly in front of a narrow storefront. A diner with foggy windows and a neon sign glowing faintly in the early evening light. I parked the car near the corner and stepped out. The air was cool. People walked past carrying groceries or talking quietly with someone beside them. Normal life happening in quiet motion. I started walking without any real destination, just following the sidewalk. As I walked, I tried to understand the feeling that had been building since the night before. It wasn't dissatisfaction. It wasn't regret. My life hadn't gone wrong, but something inside me had shifted. For years I had moved through my routine automatically. Wake up, work, home, repeat. But now I was noticing the pattern more clearly. And once you see a pattern clearly, it becomes difficult to stop seeing it. I stopped for a moment in front of the diner window. Inside, a few people sat at the counter drinking coffee. A waitress moved between the tables carrying plates. The kind of quiet place where time seems to move slightly slower. Watching the scene through the glass, I suddenly realized something. Those people inside the diner were living moments of their lives. Real ones. Small conversations. Quiet pauses. A laugh here and there. Meanwhile, I had spent years treating most of my own days like background noise. Something to move through rather than something to experience. The thought hit me gently but clearly. The distance I felt from my routine wasn't caused by the routine itself. It was caused by the way I had stopped paying attention to it. I kept walking after that. The sky was beginning to darken. Street lights flickered on above the road. And for the first time since that strange feeling had started, I felt something close to curiosity. If I had been moving through life on autopilot for so long, what would happen if I started paying attention again? Not in a dramatic way, just quietly, day by day, moment by moment. When I finally returned to my car and drove home, the house looked the same as it had the night before. Lights off, the quiet street stretching in both directions. But standing in the driveway, I realized the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like space. Space where something new might begin. Not a huge change. Not some dramatic reinvention of my life. Just a small shift in awareness. Inside the house, I turned on the kitchen light and sat down at the same table again. The glass of water. The soft hum of the refrigerator. Everything exactly where it had been before. But this time the quiet didn't feel distant. It felt closer, more real. And as I sat there thinking about the last 2 days, another realization slowly began to form. Maybe the distance I had felt from my own life wasn't something to fear. Maybe it was simply the moment before you step back inside it again. The moment when you finally notice the door and realize you've been standing just outside it for longer than you thought. That night, after coming home from the walk through the older part of the city, I didn't immediately turn on the lights in the living room. I left the kitchen light on behind me and sat down on the couch while the rest of the house stayed dim. It wasn't intentional. I just didn't feel the need to change the atmosphere. The quiet had become something I was starting to understand. For years, I had filled every empty space in the evening with noise, television, music, something playing in the background while the hours moved towards sleep. But over the last couple of days, I had noticed something. The silence wasn't the problem. The problem was how little attention I had been giving to the life happening inside that silence. I leaned back on the couch and listened to the faint sounds of the house. The refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the occasional car passing outside, a soft tapping sound somewhere in the walls when the pipes adjusted to the colder air. Ordinary noises, the kind most people stop noticing after living somewhere long enough. But tonight they felt slightly different, more real, more present. And the strange distance I had been feeling from my life over the last 2 days started to shift again. It wasn't disappearing. It was changing shape. At first, that distance had felt uncomfortable, like watching your own life from a few steps away, like observing something that should feel familiar but somehow doesn't. But now it was beginning to feel more like perspective, like stepping back from a painting in order to see the whole image. When you stand too close, you only see pieces, colors, small details. But when you step back, the structure becomes clearer. For years, I had been standing too close to my own routine. Wake up, go to work, come home, repeat. The rhythm of those days had become so normal that I stopped noticing the pattern itself. But now that I had stepped slightly outside of it, something else had become visible. The pattern wasn't the problem. The absence of awareness was. I sat there thinking about that idea for a long time. At some point, the kitchen light seemed too bright compared to the quiet room, so I stood up and turned it off. Now, the only light came from the street lamp outside the window. It cast a soft glow across the floor and part of the wall. The house looked different in that dim light, more peaceful, less structured, and somehow that made the thoughts in my head feel clearer too. The question that had followed me since the night before returned again. Why had I begun to feel like a visitor inside my own life? But this time the answer arrived faster, because I had stopped noticing it. Not suddenly, gradually, the way people stop noticing the sound of a clock ticking in a room. At first it's loud, then after a few days, your brain filters it out completely. Life can work the same way. The routines that once helped build stability slowly turn invisible. Days begin blending together. Not because anything is wrong, just because nothing demands your attention strongly enough to stand apart from the rest. And eventually, years can pass like that, smoothly, quietly, almost without friction. I thought about the man I'd seen in the car next to me the night before the red light. His calm, tired expression, the way he stared straight ahead while waiting for the traffic to move. Maybe he was simply focused on getting home. Or maybe, just for a moment, he had been feeling something similar to what I had been experiencing. That quiet awareness that your life has become a pattern you follow automatically. The strange thing is, most people probably experience that realization at some point, but they rarely stay with it long enough to understand it. Because the moment the thought appears, there are easy ways to distract yourself from it. Turn on the television, scroll through your phone, fill the silence with something else. And eventually the awareness fades again. The routine continues. But over the last 2 days, I had done something different. I had stayed with the thought, sat inside the silence long enough to see what it was actually trying to show me. And now, sitting in the dim living room, the answer felt surprisingly simple. I hadn't lost connection with my life. I had just stopped participating in it fully. Participation doesn't mean dramatic change. It doesn't require quitting your job or moving to a different city. It's something much quieter than that. It means noticing, choosing, being present in moments that used to pass unnoticed. Small things, walking instead of rushing, paying attention to conversations instead of waiting for them to end, letting a quiet evening remain quiet instead of filling it with noise. I stood up and walked to the window. The street outside was almost empty now. One porch light was still on across the road. Somewhere down the block a dog barked once, and then stopped. The air looked cold and still under the street lamp. And, standing there, I felt something shift inside me again. The distance that had started this whole realization was gone. Not because my life had changed, but because I had stepped back into it. The routine was still there. Tomorrow morning the alarm would ring at the same time. I would drive the same roads to work, sit at the same desk, talk to the same people. From the outside, nothing about my life would look different. But inside, something had moved. The pattern no longer felt like something I was watching from the outside. It felt like something I was part of again. I stayed by the window for a few more minutes. The quiet street, the soft light, the calm rhythm of the night. And for the first time since that moment in the parking lot 2 evenings earlier, I felt something close to relief. Not because I had solved anything, but because I had understood something. The distance I felt from my life had never been permanent. It was just a signal, a small reminder that awareness had quietly drifted away. And the moment I began paying attention again, the distance started to close. Eventually, I stepped away from the window and turned off the last light in the house. The darkness felt peaceful now, not empty, just quiet. As I walked toward the bedroom, I realized something else. Life doesn't always ask for dramatic change. Sometimes it only asks for attention, for presence, for the simple act of noticing the moments that were already there. Tomorrow would probably look like any other day. The same routine, the same streets, the same quiet rhythm. But now I knew something I hadn't known before. Routine doesn't make life distant. Forgetting to notice it does. And once you remember how to look again, even the most ordinary day can begin to feel like something you're actually living instead of just passing through.